Important notice. This video is a work of fiction, created exclusively for entertainment purposes and for psychological and behavioral reflection on investigative topics. In the vast red expanse of Sedona, Arizona, someone turns faith into a frontier between life and death. Clean bodies, perfect rituals, symbols no one understands, except him. A man who, by killing, believes he is liberating, not destroying. And a team that must decipher not the crime, but the myth that created it. Today, you're going to enter the mind of someone who believes they are purifying the world. One victim at a time. Part 1. The early dawn in Sedona always carried a silence that seemed far too ancient to belong to the present. Locals describe the region's darkness as a kind of spiritual mantle, something between the sacred and the misunderstood. On that day, this mantle served as the curtain for a ritual whose origin seemed to exceed the limits of human reason. The case began when a group of hikers stumbled upon something that, at first glance, looked like a ceremonial arrangement left behind for the area's spiritual tourists. The Boynton Canyon Trail, famous for its energy vortexes, received dozens of people daily seeking mental balance. But that morning, balance was absent. The scene before them looked like an aesthetically composed installation, meticulously planned, yet weighed down by a dense silence. A silence that did not belong to nature. At the center of a small plateau of reddish rocks, there was a circle made of white powder, spread uniformly, as if measured with almost surgical precision. Inside this circle lay a human figure, the body carefully positioned in a straight line, hands crossed over the abdomen like an offering prepared not for a fictional ritual, but for a deeply internalized belief. What disturbed the first observers most was not the body, already covered by a white sheet, clearly meant to hide the victim's identity, but the markings in the ground around it. All along the circle's perimeter, symbols had been carved into the earth with repetitive movements that suggested practice. They were ancient inscriptions, some resembling pre-Columbian alphabets, others reminiscent of universal ideographic forms found in various mystical traditions. There was no historical coherence, but there was order. An order only someone with unshakable conviction would execute. The white sheet over the victim wasn't simply placed. It seemed stretched, aligned, arranged with obsessive purity. No dirt, no dust, even in an outdoor setting. Someone had cleaned the body. Someone had prepared that scene as if constructing a passage ritual. When local police arrived, they immediately sensed the technical strangeness. This was not just a homicide, not just a staged display. It was something hybrid, an act of distorted faith, calculated, carrying deep internal meaning, impossible to understand at first glance. The absence of struggle already said a lot. The victim had likely been subdued before arriving there, maybe sedated, maybe convinced, maybe emotionally dominated. None of this could be confirmed, but the details narrated a silent story. The sheet was lifted only enough to confirm identity and condition. The victim was a young man wearing completely white garments beneath the outer cloth. The clothes were simple, almost monastic. And more disturbing, they were clean, washed. A process that required time, intention, ritual. His skin was also free of any dirt, indicating meticulous preparation. Whoever was responsible for that scene was not merely committing a crime. They were conducting a symbolic process that, to them, represented a sacred mission. The ground around the body showed subtle marks of knees and feet, and everything appeared carefully choreographed. There was a kind of circular path, as if the perpetrator had walked around the victim several times, perhaps reciting something, perhaps performing internal steps of a ritual known only to him. On one of the nearby stones, a small fragment of white fabric clung to an edge, as if torn during the process, reinforcing the idea of an executor with rigid, disciplined movements, but emotionally charged. The most enigmatic element emerged when one of the investigators noticed, partially buried in the red sand, a simple object, a small wooden capsule, similar to those used to store spiritual herbs. However, inside it was empty. The wood was polished on the inside, as if meant to be a symbolic receptacle, perhaps intended to contain an imaginary impurity, some fragment of belief about human sin. The lid bore a hand-carved symbol, 3 parallel lines crossed by a diagonal stroke. The same symbol appeared on the victim's arm, painted with a white substance similar to clay used in body purification rituals. Everything pointed toward a conclusion no one wanted to consider. Sedona was facing someone who saw the act of taking lives not as violence, but as spiritual purification. A distorted belief, rooted in something deeper than simple psychopathy. The perpetrator was creating a path, a process, a sequence. At the end of the initial forensic examination, a discovery expanded the scope of the investigation. At the base of the plateau, near a cluster of twisted trees, there were 7 small piles of stones, each marked with a different symbol. 7 burial markers, though none contained any trace of human remains. Symbolic burials, representations, rehearsals, as if this crime were only the first act of a larger ritual, structured in the killer's mind long ago. Police sealed off the area, but something still pulsed in the hot morning air, the sense that the perpetrator wasn't done. The way the circle was drawn, the white garments, the ritualistic cleanliness, the repeated symbol, the 7 strategic stone mounds, everything indicated an ongoing plan, not an isolated event. Sedona, known for its tourist spirituality, had never faced someone whose spirituality turned into lethal distortion. The case was too big, too ritualistic, too technical. It needed specialists who could analyze not just the crime, but the thought behind it. It needed people who read behavior the way others read sacred texts, and that's why, that very morning, one name resurfaced in detectives' conversations: MINDTRACE Division. The team that didn't chase criminals, they chased patterns, and above all, they pursued beliefs hidden at the edge of the human mind. Part 2. The news reached the MINDTRACE Division headquarters only a few hours after the discovery of the first body. The preliminary report, still fragmented, already pointed to something that couldn't be handled through the conventional lens of homicide. The ritual, the inscriptions, the obsessive cleanliness, the symbolic intention expressed in the scene. Each element suggested not just planning, but a closed, rigid, self-sustaining belief system. And cases like this required a deep reading not of the crime itself, but of the mind that shaped it. Dr. Liz Murray was the first to open the dossier sent by the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department. She always began with the silent language of details, the positioning of the body, the iconography used, the perceptible rhythm in the spatial pattern. To Liz, every crime was a sentence written in a hidden grammar, and in that case, the grammar was mystical, ritualistic, and loaded with a very specific kind of spiritual suffering. Beside her, Agent J. Carter examined the high-resolution images sent by the forensic team. The circle was mathematically precise, representing not improvisation, but practice. Jay immediately noticed the stroke of the symbol on the wooden capsule and painted on the victim's arm. The diagonal line crossing the 3 parallels indicated an idea of purifying rupture, a concept common in extreme ascetic philosophies, where purity can only exist after breaking away from the old identity. To Jay, that was the clearest sign that the perpetrator believed he was liberating, not destroying. Mark Henderson, responsible for field profiles and symbolic reconstructions, was taking quick notes while observing the 7 stone mounds found near the plateau. Each one seemed to represent a marker, a stage, almost as if they were parts of an incomplete ritual. And Mark knew this pattern well. Criminals with ritualistic beliefs rarely stop before completing the mental cycle that drives them. That number, 7, had not appeared by accident. It was symbolic, universal, recurring in spiritualist traditions, and its presence there signaled something else. This was not the perpetrator's first act, but the first visible one. The briefing meeting began minutes later, with the 3 gathered around a table covered in maps of Sedona, printouts, transcripts, video stills, symbols, and emergency forensic reports. The room stayed silent for a few moments, the kind of silence that precedes deep analysis, as if the team were synchronizing their collective perception. Liz opened the discussion. This isn't a crime motivated by anger, revenge, or impulse. It's a ritualistic expression saturated with internalized emotional suffering. He genuinely believes he's helping these people. Jay added, studying the structure of the circle. There's a rigid cognitive pattern here. We're not dealing with improvisation, but with a belief system built over years. He's performing a purification process. The cleanliness, the white garments, the body laid out without tension, the symbol. Everything indicates a ritual of spiritual rebirth. Mark then made the connection between the scene and the behavior. The most revealing element is the stone mounds. That's an internal calendar, a mental script. He's planning 7 acts, 7 liberations. This individual is not going to stop. From there, the briefing shifted into a technical deep dive into the mind behind the crime. The perpetrator seemed to carry a combination of distorted religious elements, purification beliefs, and a strong tendency to interpret suffering as a spiritual path. This triad, according to Liz, could have roots in emotional abuse, rigid religious indoctrination, or a history of moral manipulation that warped his perception of guilt and redemption. Jay analyzed the probable psychological pattern. Someone who doesn't see himself as a murderer, but as a spiritual mediator. Someone who experiences intense existential guilt, transformed into a mission. This explained the obsessive cleaning of the body. There was no instrumental violence, there was a transition ritual. For this perpetrator, every movement had meaning, every gesture, a function, every victim, a symbol. Mark evaluated the physical environment. Sedona, with its energy vortexes, spiritualist communities, alternative cults, hybrid shamanic traditions, and esoteric tourism, offered the perfect setting for a fragile mind to build its own cosmology. The perpetrator wasn't just hiding there, he was feeding off the symbolic environment. He needed that territory. He needed the red landscape, the idea of energy, the collective belief in the transcendental. The team then assessed the risks. The perpetrator has likely already selected his next victims. He operates in cycles of purification and symbolic burial. He believes he is completing a spiritual process of liberation. He carries intense emotional self-sacrifice, meaning he may risk his own life without hesitation. He is not impulsive. He is methodical, disciplined, and emotionally convinced. Once the briefing concluded, Liz was clear. This case demands deep behavioral reading. His logic isn't social, it's spiritual. We need to understand the internal myth. Only then can we intercept the next act before the cycle completes. The MINDTRACE Division departed for Sedona hours later. There, among ancient rocks and modern beliefs, a fragmented mind was rewriting its own vision of reincarnation. A reincarnation born not from life, but from ritualized death. Part 3. When the MINDTRACE Division arrived in Sedona, the sun was already descending between the sandstone formations, creating bands of light that cut across the landscape like golden blades. The team always observed the environment before any direct analysis. To them, the setting wasn't just a backdrop, it was a psychological component, an active piece of the criminal's behavior. And in Sedona, this was even more evident. The first analysis began on the plateau where the body had been found. Liz Murray walked slowly around the circle, avoiding stepping near the inscriptions preserved by forensics. She observed the design, the texture of the soil, the alignment with the light, the position of the plateau in relation to the rock formations. Each element told a story invisible to ordinary eyes. The circle was approximately 3 meters in diameter, created with white powder of uniform granulation. This indicated prior preparation. The perpetrator likely brought the material in a dedicated container and spread it with a trained motion. There were no flaws, no buildup, no hesitation. This already revealed an important component: emotional control during the act. An impulsive criminal does not achieve this level of precision. Jay Carter positioned himself at the highest point of the plateau, observing the overall geometry of the scene. He always analyzed spatial behavior first, the invisible bodily signature each perpetrator leaves without realizing it. Jay noticed that the distribution of the elements suggested an internal choreography. The criminal moved in a circular pattern, passing repeatedly through the same points as if performing a transition ritual. This reinforced the hypothesis of disciplined spiritual obsession, where each movement symbolizes an internal meaning. Meanwhile, Mark Henderson examined the inscriptions in the soil. They weren't symbols from a specific tradition, but a spiritual collage, mixing elements from various cultures. This symbolic blending revealed something crucial. The perpetrator wasn't reproducing a learned ritual, he was creating his own doctrine. And personal doctrines, according to Mark, are more dangerous than borrowed ones. They follow no external logic, only the internal emotional and traumatic architecture of the individual. The wooden capsule found near the site became one of the most significant elements. Liz held it with gloves, observing its rustic simplicity. It was a handmade object, perhaps created by the perpetrator himself, perhaps purchased in local spiritual shops that sold purification tools. But the detail that stood out was the engraved symbol, 3 parallel lines crossed by a diagonal. This symbol did not correspond directly to classic mystical systems, but conveyed an intuitive meaning: rupture, cleansing, restart. Liz concluded, the perpetrator creates symbols not for communication, but for internal reinforcement. This object functions as a psychological marker, something that reminds the offender of his mission. As they observed the body's position, the calm posture, the ritualistic cleanliness, the white garments, and the absence of signs of improvisation, the team began outlining what they call the cognitive architecture of the ritual, the set of beliefs guiding the criminal's behavior. And from that point, the first formal hypotheses emerged. 1. The perpetrator believes he is performing a sacrament of liberation. The body's cleansing signifies symbolic removal of impurities. The white clothing represents spiritual rebirth. The circle represents passage between states, life and purification. The symbolic burial is the final seal. The perpetrator does not perceive himself as an aggressor. He sees himself as an agent of redemption. 2. The perpetrator has emotional trauma connected to oppressive religiosity. This conclusion emerged as they linked the ritualistic behavior to the need for extreme purification. People subjected to prolonged religious abuse often develop intense existential guilt, internalized fear of sin, permanent desire for redemption, polarized view of purity and impurity, emotional and physical self-penitence, literal interpretations of pain as a path to transcendence. To Liz, this was evident. The perpetrator does not believe he is punishing the victims. He believes he is saving them from the weight he himself carries. 3. The Sedona environment functions as symbolic fuel. Mark analyzed the offender's relationship with the territory. Sedona is marked by beliefs associated with energy, healing, vortexes, transcendence, and spiritual rebirth. For a traumatized and fragmented mind, this environment becomes external justification for the internal world. He observed, this perpetrator chose Sedona not for geography, but for meaning. He believes he is in sacred territory, a kind of spiritual portal. 4. The ritual cycle consists of 7 stages. This was the most concerning piece of information. The 7 stone mounds found below the plateau were organized, linear, almost like progress markers. Jay interpreted them as stages of purification. The team concluded each mound represents a completed or planned stage. The cycle demands 7 acts, and 1 victim had already been found. Therefore, there was a real risk of 6 more deaths if the cycle continued. 5. The perpetrator lives in constant conflict between self-punishment and spiritual mission. Analyzing details of the scene, knee marks in the soil, traces of emotional pressure, manual wear, Mark noticed signs of self-sacrifice. It was possible the perpetrator performed rituals on himself between crimes, not violence against himself but symbolic penitence, long prayers, fasting, extreme walks, sensory deprivation. Jay reinforced, this person is at war with himself. Pain has become spiritual language. The external world works as a mirror of the internal battle. With these initial hypotheses, The team gathered again at the improvised command center near the trail. The red rocks reflected the evening light, creating a contrast that seemed to amplify symbolically the central theme of the investigation: purity and impurity, light and shadow, pain and redemption. Liz presented the day's most important conclusion. The perpetrator is not killing to end lives. He is finishing stories to restart them in his personal cosmology. Jay added, he feels neither hatred nor pleasure. He feels duty. And Mark concluded, when a criminal believes he is performing a sacred mission, behavioral prediction becomes harder. He doesn't fear punishment. He fears failing his doctrine. The initial analysis was complete. From that point on, MINDTRACE's goal was not just to uncover the ritual, it was to understand the internal myth that sustained the killer. Because only by decoding the myth would it be possible to break the cycle. Part 4. The next morning brought a different kind of silence to Sedona. Tenser, heavier, as if the landscape itself understood that this was not an isolated crime. The MINDTRACE Division knew that ritualistic offenders rarely begin a process of this magnitude without a second act already underway. What they did not expect was for that second act to surface so soon. The discovery occurred when search teams expanded the perimeter around the plateau. The directive was clear: follow secondary trails, difficult access areas, and points symbolically aligned with the first site. Mark had outlined 3 probable zones on the map where the perpetrator might continue his ritual, locations with similar characteristics: isolation, symbolic energy, circular landscapes, or the presence of natural structures considered portals in spiritualist beliefs. Around 10 a.m., an auxiliary team found something unusual in a fissure between 2 large rocks known by locals as Cathedral Gap. At first glance, it looked like another ritual formation, an arch of stones, carefully stacked in a semicircle, opening into a small clearing naturally lit by a vertical crack in the cliffside. The light entered as a narrow beam, creating a central focal point, almost a natural altar. And in the center of that light, there was another body. The second body had been arranged similarly to the first, aligned, clean, dressed in white. But there were significant differences that would provide MINDTRACE with crucial information to reconstruct the killer's pattern. The team's arrival was marked by absolute silence. Liz, Jay, and Mark walked slowly, absorbing every detail with the precision of people who read behavior as if it were text. The reconstruction began with the space. Mark mentally traced the offender's movement flow. He had likely entered through the narrow part of the canyon, carrying the victim already sedated, or unconscious, or emotionally subdued. The arrangement of the stones suggested prior preparation. The semicircle had not been built that day. It was a pre-planned structure indicating that the killer had multiple locations prepared, each representing a distinct stage of his cycle. Jay approached the victim carefully. The white sheet covering part of the body had a fold different from the one seen in the first crime. The upper fold formed a straighter, more rigid line, as if the perpetrator were adjusting his own method. This indicated ritualistic evolution, progressive refinement. And evolution means growing psychological confidence, which makes the criminal more certain, faster, and more determined. Liz examined the ground inscriptions. They were similar to those at the first site, but now the symbols displayed variations. The symbol of the 3 lines crossed by the diagonal reappeared, but this time accompanied by a new element, a small circular mark above the lines. Mark identified this addition as a progression sign. To the perpetrator, this wasn't just another step. It was the second phase of an ascending process. He was advancing. Next to the body was something absent from the first scene, a small ceramic container. Inside it, only a handful of red earth, carefully collected. Liz interpreted this immediately. The container represented the removed impurity, the symbolically transferred guilt. It was as if the offender were isolating the victim's impure essence to return it to the sacred ground, thus completing his rebirth ritual. The reconstruction then moved to analyzing the body's posture. Unlike the first victim, whose positioning conveyed ritual serenity, The second displayed subtle muscular differences, not signs of violence, but signs of prior tension. This indicated that the victim was not entirely passive during the preparatory stage, revealing an important factor. The perpetrator was growing more confident and reducing hesitation. His belief in the process was increasing, and when conviction rises, speed increases. Mark analyzed the tracks around the area. There were footprints forming a spiral pattern, different from the circular pattern of the first crime. This was decisive. The first circle represented purification. The second spiral pattern represented transition. Liz recorded, "He is following an internal liturgy. Each victim represents a distinct phase in his cosmology." Jay added, "If the pattern continues, the third scene will be even richer in symbols. We need to map potential locations of spiritual progression now, sites of ascension, overlooks, higher energy points." But the most disturbing element of the reconstruction appeared when the team found, just a few meters away, a new stone mound, one that differed from the original 7. This one was larger, more elaborate, and marked with the new symbol, the 3 lines, the diagonal, and the additional circle. This confirmed that the cycle had not only begun, but was being updated with each victim. The killer was expanding his doctrine during the process. Another detail stood out. Near the base of the mound were discrete knee marks, as if the perpetrator had remained in that position for a long period, perhaps in prayer or meditation. This reinforced the hypothesis of spiritual self-punishment. The further the cycle progressed, the greater the emotional strain on the perpetrator himself seemed to be. The final reconstruction analysis revealed: 1. The killer has pre-prepared locations, at least 7. 2. Each location represents a distinct stage of his ritual. 3. The method evolves at each stage, demonstrating growing confidence. 4. There is a strong component of emotional self-purification behind the acts. 5. The perpetrator is trapped in a distorted but coherent moral logic. 6. Victim selection follows a spiritual pattern, not a social or demographic one. Liz then summarized, "We're dealing with someone living in internal collapse between guilt and sacred mission. His cycle isn't impulsive, it's structured, and he will only stop when he completes the 7th stage or when we interrupt him psychologically." With 2 bodies, the cycle was accelerating. The criminal's spiritual map was unfolding before the team. And each new discovery brought MINDTRACE closer not only to his mind, but to the next location before another life was turned into a symbol. The reconstruction was complete, and the offender's internal clock kept ticking. Part 5. The development of the killer's psychological profile, now with 2 confirmed victims, became the central point of the investigation. Every element found at the scenes, every symbol, every spatial and ritualistic pattern offered a piece of what Liz Murray called the architecture of pain, the internal structure of beliefs and traumas that shaped the offender's behavior. And the more the team analyzed, the clearer it became. The perpetrator wasn't driven by anger, pleasure, or impulse. He was driven by spiritual necessity, an urgency born from trauma. Liz began building the formal profile from an emotional equation. Religious trauma, plus internalized guilt, plus need for purification, plus spiritual dissociation, externally projected redemption ritual. To her, the pattern was clear. The offender had been subjected to an environment where guilt wasn't merely taught, but imposed, where the individual was constantly reminded of their impurity and moral insufficiency, where penitence, obedience, and suffering were interpreted as obligatory paths. And that kind of environment leaves deep marks, marks that don't disappear, they transform. 1. The offender carries a history of emotional and religious abuse. Liz identified that the symbolic structure of the rituals wasn't copied from specific traditions, but derived from fragmented past experiences. This means the offender likely grew up in a context where sacred texts were used as instruments of control, sin was associated with personal identity, purity was unattainable, silence was mandatory, emotional pain was seen as a tool of purification, Spiritual authority was absolute and unquestionable. This combination often produces personalities that are hypercritical of themselves, people who, in the absence of affection, learn to interpret pain as a path to approval. People who internalize the belief that only through renunciation and suffering can one achieve belonging. Liz summarized it this way: he's not trying to save the victims, he's trying to save himself through them. 2. The killer shows signs of dysfunctional spirituality and psychological self-flagellation. The team identified clear patterns of emotional self-sacrifice. The prolonged kneeling marks, the rigidity of ritual movements, the time spent preparing the sites, everything indicated an intense relationship between suffering and devotion. Jay analyzed this through a cognitive lens. Individuals who experience religious abuse tend to create a second internal religion in adulthood, a religion of their own, built from pain, the need for control, and the attempt to rewrite their spiritual history. This type of belief functions as constant punishment, endless penitence, attempt at personal redemption, need to atone for old wounds, projection of personal guilt onto external symbols. Thus, each victim is not seen as a person, but as a metaphor. As a symbolic container for a sin the offender believes he carries within himself. 3. The offender displays spiritual dissociation. Spiritual dissociation occurs when trauma, belief, and identity merge so intensely that the person loses the ability to separate internal experience from external meaning. Mark identified this dissociation through 3 signs. 1. The rituals are fixed, yet also evolving. The perpetrator doesn't merely follow a liturgy, he alters his own liturgy as he progresses, as if receiving internal revelations. 2. The topography is chosen for emotional meaning. Sedona is not a setting, it is a mirror. The landscape reinforces the purification delusion. 3. The victims are treated as stages, not individuals. The transition from the first circle to the spiral in the second crime reveals internal spiritual evolution. Jay noted that this type of dissociation means the perpetrator operates in 2 simultaneous dimensions: the real world, where he executes the acts, the internal world, where he interprets everything as part of a spiritual narrative. When these 2 worlds collide, ritualistic behavior emerges. 4. The 7-stage cycle reflects an original trauma. Liz deeply analyzed the meaning of the number 7 in a psychological context. The offender did not choose this number by chance. 7 is often associated with purification, rebirth, spiritual cycles, transition rituals, enlightenment stages, initiatory journeys, sacred structures of rigid religiosity. In his case, the number likely relates to a past event. 7 punishments, 7 stages of discipline, 7 days of isolation, 7 required prayers, 7 trials, 7 falls, 7 confessed sins. Something in childhood or adolescence marked him permanently, and he is now replicating it as a way of completing something that was never resolved. 5. The offender does not feel pleasure, he feels relief. This is a central point. Unlike impulsive or sadistic criminals, this offender is guided by an internal moral logic. To him, the ritual is not violence, it is liberation, it is not destruction, it is transition. It is not sin, it is spiritual duty. Jay describes this as ritualistic relief. After each stage, the offender feels briefly closer to purification, but the feeling never lasts, and that's why he moves to the next victim. 6. The offender likely shows physical signs of self-punishment. Liz highlighted that people with dysfunctional spirituality often practice microforms of penitence: extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, long walks under intense heat, exhaustion practices, repetitive prayers, prolonged kneeling. These behaviors leave marks, not violent, but visible. Joint wear, dry skin, muscle rigidity, mild sunburns, weight loss, exhausted gaze. The killer carries his body as a religious instrument, and the external ritual is only an extension of the internal ritual. 7. Primary emotional profile: sacred chronic guilt. This term defines a specific behavioral disorder. Guilt does not come from actions, it comes from existence. Identity is perceived as flawed. The individual develops a need for constant purification. Suffering becomes language. Pain becomes discipline. The act symbolizes personal atonement. It is a rare profile but extremely dangerous because it is immune to punishment. The only language that can interrupt this cycle is symbolic. Mark concludes, he doesn't fear being captured, he fears being prevented from completing the ritual. And Liz finishes, if we want to find him, we can't just follow the evidence, we need to decode the internal myth he created. The killer's mind was partially revealed. But to stop the cycle before the third victim, the team would have to discover not only who he is, but what the next stage of his distorted spiritual path would be. Part 6. From the second body onward, Sedona entered a state of silent vigilance. Local police increased patrols, helicopters swept remote areas, and residents began reporting any detail that could, even remotely, appear connected to the case. And as happens in investigations involving ritualistic elements, false leads began emerging forcefully. The MINDTRACE Division always exercised caution in such moments. Rituals evoke fear. Fear produces rushed interpretations. And rushed interpretations create investigative noise. Noise that can cost lives when a killer operates according to their own emotional calendar. The first false lead surfaced when a spiritual guide from the region reported having seen a hooded man performing rituals along a trail near the Red Rock vortexes. The description initially seemed promising: a solitary individual, repetitive gestures, murmuring, rigid posture. The combination immediately alerted officials. Liz, Jay, and Mark went to the location accompanied by patrol units. Upon arriving, they did find signs of recent human activity: small melted candles, circular marks in the soil, and a set of aligned stones. But a closer examination made it clear to MINDTRACE that the content didn't match the killer's style. The candles were colorful, used in modern meditation practices. The symbols were far too geometric, lacking the raw emotional imprint found in the offender's inscriptions. And there were tourist pamphlets nearby, indicating amateur practice, not disciplined ritual. Jay summarized the scene precisely. This is spiritual exploration, not ritualistic obsession. But the mobilization had consumed time the killer would use to advance internally into his third stage. The second false lead came from what initially seemed like an extremely promising sign: footprints near the second body, found after a more detailed sweep of the rocky fissure. The footprints matched the size of an adult male, with depth consistent with someone carrying weight and direction apparently linked to the perpetrator's path. The preliminary analysis seemed clear: they were likely the killer's footprints. But as they mapped the trails more precisely, inconsistencies emerged. The footprints repeated at mathematical intervals, as if left by someone walking at a steady pace, not someone tense from executing a ritual. The track ended abruptly near a tourist area closed for renovations, and the step distances were too long, indicating the individual was using professional hiking gear. Mark evaluated the pattern. This belongs to a local guide carrying equipment. Nothing indicates emotional strain, nothing indicates ritual. More time wasted. And a reminder that Sedona's environment, with its busy trails and mystical tourism, created countless traces capable of masking or imitating genuine elements of the case. The third false lead was more complex and almost derailed the entire investigation. 3 residents reported hearing strange chants during the night, coming from an abandoned shelter near an isolated valley. The information made immediate sense. A ritualistic killer could use abandoned spaces for preparation. The team rushed there, fearing they might find signs of the next stage. Inside the structure, they indeed found marks on the ground, circular patterns, a few lines, pieces of white fabric. Liz sensed instinctively that the scene didn't match the emotional aesthetic of the perpetrator, but there were enough elements to create initial doubt. A deeper analysis revealed the mistake. The shelter had been used days earlier by a group of young tourists practicing energy alignment rituals, something common in the region. The white fabric was part of themed clothing sold in esoteric shops, and the chants reported were simply recordings played from portable speakers. Another lead discarded. More hours consumed. Another step gained by the killer. The fourth false lead, however, forced MINDTRACE to reconsider assumptions. A surveillance drone detected an irregular circular area in a remote western zone, and this one did look promising. The circular shape was large, well-defined, isolated by miles of landscape. Everything suggested potential connection to the case. The team arrived by helicopter, and for long minutes everything seemed to match. The circular formation, the cleared center, the absence of vegetation. But upon closer examination, they realized that despite aesthetic similarities to the killer's work, the structure was different. It was an old spiritual gathering area used by mystic communities in the 90s. A historical remnant, not a contemporary ritual. No recent symbols, no coherent emotional marks, no relevant evidence. Mark closed his notebook and took a deep breath. This case is responding more to our expectations than to the facts. We need to go back to his mind. The fifth false lead was the most emotionally dangerous for the team. A tourist had photographed by chance a man walking alone with something white in his arms at dusk. The photo was distant, blurry, but enough to trigger alarm. The white object could be anything: a towel, a cloth, camping gear. But collective fear immediately turned the sighting into a suspect. When MINDTRACE analyzed the image, Jay noticed something subtle. The man's posture was slightly inclined, typical of someone carrying a lightweight object, not someone transporting significant weight. With enhanced zoom, they confirmed it was merely a rolled white cloth, likely used for amateur photography. The photo went viral among residents, creating panic and pressuring the police. But it was another false alarm. All these false leads created a dangerous mental landscape. Excess signals, lack of focus, and time slipping away while a ritualistic mind advanced through its symbolic spiral. And while all of Sedona was pointing in the wrong directions, the killer moved silently toward his third spiritual stage. MINDTRACE knew that before finding him, they would need to distinguish true, distorted sacredness from the city's spiritual echoes. The cycle was accelerating, and the next act would be decisive. Part 7. The MINDTRACE Division had learned, after years of analyzing fragmented minds, that ritualistic killers don't leave obvious clues. They leave internal echoes projected onto the external world. Every symbol, every placement, every seemingly trivial object was part of a psychological lexicon that needed to be translated, not simply interpreted. And it was exactly this shift in perspective that allowed the crucial discovery to emerge. After hours spent analyzing false leads, Liz felt the need to return to the basics. Instead of searching for new signs, she decided to revisit the two crime scenes with a single question. What is he trying to communicate to us involuntarily? She wasn't looking for evidence, she was looking for emotional patterns. At the first scene, the perfect circle. At the second, the ascending spiral. Both had inscriptions, but with variations. Both had mounds, but with different symbols. Both had purification elements, but with distinct intensities. That was when Liz realized that the evolved symbol, 3 parallel lines, a diagonal stroke, and now the upper circle, wasn't just evolution. It was a progressive signature, a kind of internal map. The more she studied it, the more she perceived that added circle didn't just represent progression, it represented orientation. She asked Jay to digitize the symbols found and arrange them in layered overlays. The overlay revealed something none of them had anticipated. When placed in sequence, the symbols weren't just marks. They formed a diagram. The diagram resembled a route, a graphic representation of internal and external movement, a trail of distorted faith. Meanwhile, Mark analyzed Sedona's topography. He noticed that, interestingly, both the first and second locations had a peculiar relationship to the sun's position at the hours when the killer was believed to have performed the rituals. It wasn't coincidence, the two locations were aligned with specific solar incidence points on nearby rock formations. This discovery, when cross-referenced with the symbolic diagram Jay had assembled, sparked an insight. The symbols, when reorganized according to solar positioning, appeared to point toward a third geographic location. a place where the light projected onto a formation known as Crown Ridge, famous for creating a luminous arch at sunrise. Liz realized he's following a ritual of spiritual ascension. The scenes aren't random, they're markers. The team overlaid the real map with the symbolic diagram. The first two locations aligned perfectly with two marked lines of the composite symbol. The third stage, the one the perpetrator was about to perform, pointed to a specific location, an elevated plateau to the north, accessible only by narrow trails, known as the Crown Altar. But the crucial discovery wasn't just the location, it was the why. As they examined the pattern, Jay understood something profound about the killer's mind. He did not choose places based on accessibility, isolation, or chance. He chose places that represented himself. The circle, his childhood, marked by guilt and unattainable purity. The spiral, his adulthood, attempting to break free from suffocating internal beliefs. The third stage, represented in the symbol as an ascending semicircle, reflected an act of spiritual elevation, almost as if it were the most important moment of the cycle. Liz voiced the discovery. He isn't just purifying the victims, he's reconstructing his own emotional history stage by stage. Mark connected this to patterns of religious abuse. Many rigid religions use 3 stages of penitence: purification, transition, and elevation. If he's recreating a spiritual process based on his own pain, the third stage will be the most intense for him. And then came the real revelation, not about the next location, but about the next target. Jay cross-referenced the emotional pattern with the 2 victim profiles already identified. The team had initially believed the victims were chosen randomly, people found alone, vulnerable, easily subdued. But when examining photographs provided by the families, something stood out. Both victims had recently been on spiritual quests. Both had participated in emotionally intense retreats. Both were experiencing moments of existential fragility. This was not coincidence. The killer wasn't seeking physical profiles. He was seeking emotional profiles, people carrying internal dilemmas, personal guilt, fear of existential failure, a sense of spiritual inadequacy. People who mirrored what he felt inside. Liz concluded, he sees incomplete versions of himself in them. He believes he's freeing pieces of his own soul. This insight redefined the entire investigation. Suddenly, the behavioral maps, the internal doctrine, the ritualistic cycle, and the symbolic diagram all connected. Location, May's symbol, May's victim's emotional condition. And it was within that triad that the final discovery emerged. Mark found in recent patrol records a report of a woman seen meditating alone for an extended time, exactly in the area of the Crown Altar. A tourist newly arrived for a spiritual retreat. Emotionally fitting profile, vulnerable, disconnected from her group. She was the exact emotional mirror the killer sought. The crucial discovery was complete. 1. The killer was following his own spiritual map. 2. The third stage was already chosen, and it was the Crown Altar. 3. The future victim was already in the vicinity. 4. The cycle would enter its highest and most decisive point within hours. Liz spoke only 1 sentence, but everyone felt the weight of it. If we don't go now, he completes the third stage. The team departed immediately. The killer's ritualistic clock was minutes away from striking its next symbolic hour. And the case, until then wrapped in mystery, finally revealed its central axis. Part 8. The path to the Crown Altar was not just steep, it was silent in an almost ritualistic way, as if the trail itself understood that something was about to break there. The rock formation seemed to watch the team as they climbed, each step carrying the sense that the landscape was sharing a secret too ancient to be spoken aloud. The MINDTRACE Division advanced with precision. Liz at the front, reading the environment as one reads emotions. Mark observing patterns in the ground, tracks, deviations, flows. Jay analyzing the terrain's geometry, trying to anticipate the exact point where the killer would create the third composition of his ritual. The altitude increased, the wind shifted, The light began taking on a clearer tone, filtered through the natural opening in the rocks. The crown altar revealed itself slowly, an elevated semicircular plateau surrounded by formations that resembled eroded stone crowns. It was a spot many described as an energy portal, but at that moment, it carried not transcendence, but urgency. Before reaching the main plateau, the team found their first confirmation that they were close. Marks on the ground. Lines drawn with white powder, still fresh. An incomplete symbol. The 3 parallel lines, the diagonal, and now an upper crescent. It was the third evolution. The third stage. And as predicted, there was also the corresponding ritualistic object. A small wooden bowl filled with red earth mixed with white pigment. Liz observed it as if listening to a silent confession. He's already started. When they reached the top, the scene emerged restrained, carefully organized, like everything the perpetrator did. At the center was the beginning of the ascending circle of the third stage. Beside it lay a white cloth folded with perfection, the clothes that would be used for the victim. There was also a small natural fiber bag, indicating that the killer had brought specific ritual tools. But what caught Liz's attention was not the symbol, nor the preparation. It was the emotional silence in the space. A silence that didn't belong to the environment. It belonged to the perpetrator. He was there, sitting at the edge of the plateau, back facing the team, in a prayer posture, body bowed over his knees, hands pressed to the ground, head lowered, slow breathing, as if he were waiting for something, not someone. Beside him, a few meters to the left, was the woman who would have become the third victim. Alive, frightened but in a state of emotional torpor, as if under the effect of psychological shock, not physical force. Sitting, hands on the ground, eyes fixed in emptiness. She wasn't tied. The control he exerted over her was mental, not physical. Liz raised her hand to keep everyone from advancing. The key to this confrontation wasn't force. It was psychology. The killer remained still, as if he sensed their presence without reacting to it. The long, deep breath he took indicated he was aware of the approach, but he showed no fear, no surprise, only acceptance. Liz took a few steps forward, slow, calculated steps, without a hint of threat. The moment unfolded with emotional clarity, as if narrated by the landscape itself. The scene resembled a meeting between two belief systems, the killer's belief in his sacred mission, and MINDTRACE's belief that any mind, no matter how broken, still seeks a meaning that can be decoded. The man slowly lifted his face, though he didn't turn fully. His body was steady, not stiff with tension, but steady like someone who had no intention of running or resisting. Like someone who had already accepted his final role in the cycle. Liz kept a safe distance, respecting not the physical danger, but the symbolic space of the perpetrator. She knew, to invade his emotional boundary too abruptly could trigger collapse or impulsive action. She had to enter his world, not destroy it. The perpetrator finally spoke, not with his voice, but with his body. He raised one hand and touched the symbol drawn on the ground, completing the upper curve with his fingertips. That gesture said everything. It was the sign that he was about to complete the third stage. Liz broke the silence with a neutral, deep, almost priest-like tone, the only tone capable of reaching someone in that dissociative state. "You've reached the place you always believed you needed to be." The man froze. His hand halted over the white powder. It was as if for the first time someone had used his language. Not to validate him, but to access him. Jay immediately sensed the emotional impact. The killer wasn't hearing words, he was hearing meaning. Liz continued, "But each stage you recreated didn't free you. It only repeated something that was forced on you." The killer's body contracted slightly. Not with anger, with memory. Liz had touched the core of the trauma. You're not purifying anyone. You're trying to erase a pain that was never your burden to carry. The man finally turned his face a little more. His eyes were red not from violence but from profound emotional exhaustion. the kind that comes from believing one's own existence must be constantly rebuilt. Mark noticed his hands trembling, the first sign of rupture in the ritual trance. Liz took another step. You don't need to complete 7 stages, the third is enough for you to be seen, without the guilt placed on your shoulders. The man breathed deeply, like someone forced to choose between 2 opposing realities. The distorted faith that shaped him, and the possibility of being understood for the first time. Jay then made the final movement, not physical, but symbolic. He approached the victim slowly and lifted his open hand in the air, showing there was no threat, only protection. The perpetrator saw it, and something broke inside him. He released the white powder from his hand. The third stage ceased to exist in that instant. His body collapsed emotionally. There was no violence, no escape, no attack, only psychological surrender. The spiritual collapse of someone who carried an unbearable burden for years. Liz approached slowly, allowing the decision to come from him. And when he finally lowered his head to the ground, MINDTRACE knew. The confrontation had been concluded, not by force, but by understanding. Part 9. The emotional surrender of the killer did not mean the end of the operation. For the MINDTRACE Division, the most delicate moment of an interrupted ritual was always the post-collapse phase, the fragile space between abandoning the belief and returning to a state of reality. It was there, in that unstable psychological terrain, that many ritualistic offenders became unpredictable. But what happened at the crown altar was something rare, a moment of silent surrender, as symbolic as the rituals the man had been performing. The offender remained kneeling, head down, breathing unsteady. He didn't try to run. He didn't look around for escape routes. He didn't say a word. It was as if he had lost the ritualistic language that sustained his internal cycle, as if the myth that kept him standing had dissolved right before his own eyes. Jay approached first, moving with controlled slowness. MINDTRACE never approached a ritualistic criminal in emotional dissociation too quickly. The goal wasn't physical capture, but preserving the psychological bridge they had built. Any abrupt movement could provoke not aggression, but cognitive disintegration. When Jay was only a few steps away, the offender lifted his head just enough to reveal his face, not in defiance, but in surrender. A look silently asking someone to take control he had never been able to take over himself. A look of spiritual collapse. Liz maintained the tone that had opened cracks in his ritual. You don't need to continue. Those simple words were the emotional seal of surrender. The offender exhaled one last long breath, a kind of final release, and then placed his open hands on the ground, slowly crossing his arms behind his head, as someone who gives up not only his body, but his belief itself. It wasn't submission to force, it was surrender to relief. From a technical standpoint, it was the perfect capture. No resistance, no physical tension, no violent collapse, no attempt to flee, no threat, only acceptance. Mark approached the third victim. The woman was still in emotional torpor, without physical restraints, breathing rapidly but conscious. He offered water, spoke calmly, and evaluated signs of psychological disorientation. It was evident she had not been harmed. The control the offender exercised was spiritual, based on presence, soft voice, and narratives of purification. She had entered an emotional trance induced by the intensity of the setting and the psychological pressure of the offender. Local police began ascending the trail minutes later, guided by the signals left by MINDTRACE. And meanwhile, the offender remained motionless, as someone awaiting an internal judgment greater than any human imprisonment. The descent was slow, not because the man resisted, but because his body seemed fragile, as if years of spiritual self-penitence had taken more from him than the rituals themselves revealed. He walked guided by the agents, head bowed, eyes fixed on the ground, like someone who, for the first time, saw his own life as a physical path instead of a spiritual one. Along the way, Liz observed subtle details. Marked knees, stiffness in his back, extreme fatigue, short breaths, ritualized foot movements, even unintentionally. It was the body of someone who had lived more inside the myth than in reality. A man who learned to punish himself believing he was ascending. When they reached the base of the trail, the third victim was taken for emergency psychological care. She repeated fragmented phrases, trying to understand how she had been drawn to that point on the trail. Her spiritual vulnerability had been the link. The offender hadn't chosen her by chance. He had sensed in her the same emptiness he had carried inside since childhood. Once on stable ground, the emotional atmosphere began to shift. The weight of the ritual gave way to the weight of truth. The local team handcuffed the offender carefully, maintaining the same symbolic respect Liz had established. Jay noticed that even handcuffed, he kept his hands aligned, as if every bodily position still needed to obey an internal code. It was the residue of a lifetime of forced obedience. As he was escorted to the vehicle, Mark noticed one last detail. The offender looked up at the sky only once, not in supplication, but in acknowledgement. It was the look of someone who finally understood that the sky no longer belonged to him. Reporters waiting nearby were kept at a distance. MINDTRACE did not allow exposure that could reinforce myths or turn ritualistic offenders into figures of public symbolism. The priority was preserving the emotional integrity of the victims and preventing the offender's belief from being romanticized or replicated. Inside the vehicle, as the doors closed, the man made his first voluntary movement since the surrender. He pressed his forehead against his cuffed wrists, as if recognizing that this gesture, identical to the one he used in prayer, now had a different meaning, not devotion, but ending. The ride to the station was silent. No words, no resistance, only the sound of the vehicle traveling down the road toward a place where rituals had no place. Upon arrival, he was taken to a psychological containment room, where specialists would assess his mental state before the formal interrogation. Liz observed through the glass window as he sat at the edge of the cot, not looking at anyone, but without slipping back into trance. The 7-stage cycle would never be completed. The final symbol would remain unfinished. The third stage would be the breaking point, the moment when emotional pain finally met interruption. And in MINDTRACE's internal report, Liz wrote the sentence that defined with surgical precision the heart of the case. He wasn't captured, he was interrupted. The difference was profound, and in this case, it saved lives. Part 10. When night fell over Sedona once again, the red rocks seemed to breathe an ancient silence, as if they carried within themselves all the stories that had passed through the region. Stories of faith, of searching, of light, and, at times, of shadow. And among those shadows now rested the memory of a man who confused pain with destiny, guilt with mission, suffering with purity. The MINDTRACE Division remained for hours watching the city settle into the evening, as if trying to absorb the final invisible layer of meaning left behind by the case. Because in the end, this investigation had never been just about capturing a criminal. It was about recognizing how broken beliefs can shape entire lives. How spirituality, when distorted by trauma, can become a mirror in which the mind can no longer see itself clearly. Sedona, with all its beauty, had been the stage for a silent struggle between two worlds. The internal world of a man devastated by emotional and religious abuse, and the external world trying to understand what would drive someone to turn spirituality into penitence. Liz Murray stood by the window of the improvised command center, watching the outline of the mountains slowly disappear into the dark. For her, every case left a mark, not a wound, but a remembrance. A reminder that behind every psychological crime, there is always a story that once belonged to a vulnerable child, shaped by voices far too harsh, too rigid, too relentless. Jay Carter wrote his final notes, describing the offender's cognitive pattern as a cycle of inherited guilt translated into personal liturgy. It was common, he always said, for traumatized minds to create internal mythologies when they don't find external answers. And sometimes those mythologies become invisible prisons. Mark Henderson, in turn, mentally reviewed all the scenes. The circles, the spirals, the stacked stones, the incomplete symbols. To him, each drawing in the soil was a primitive attempt to reorganize internal chaos. The offender wasn't purifying the world. He was trying to purify himself in a journey that would never bring him the relief he sought. In the closing of the official report, MINDTRACE wrote something that spoke not only about the case but about the human condition. Spirituality can heal, but it can also imprison when it is born from pain rather than freedom. And every mind that does not find refuge will in some way try to reinvent its own destiny, even if that means getting lost along the way. The woman who almost became the third victim received psychological care, and in time she would understand that what brought her to Sedona's trails was not a mystical calling, but a silent search for meaning. The same search that dragged the offender into a ritual without end. And Sedona, at last, returned to its usual silence. But now it was a different silence, not the silence that conceals, but the silence that learns. MINDTRACE left the city at dawn, as the first light touched the red earth once more. And in that light, there was a simple truth. Some stories do not end with capture, but with the understanding that every mind can be broken, and every belief can be rewritten, for healing or for harm. MINDTRACE's work is to prevent pain from becoming destiny. And in this case, by interrupting the ritual before the third stage, that is exactly what they did.